She was 19 years old when they dragged her from her father's forge in the dead of night, and left her standing in the frost with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single hammer clutched so tightly in her fist that her knuckles had gone white and bloodless. Clara Voss had grown up in the ring of that anvil, had learned the language of hot iron before she had learned to write her own name. And now, in the space of one drunken hand of cards, she had lost the only home she had ever known. What she did not know, what the mountain itself had kept folded in its cold stone belly for 30 years, was that a ruined smelting furnace on the slope above the valley was waiting to give her back everything that had been stolen. And then some. Settle in and stay close, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. To understand what happened to Clara Voss in the ashes of Cinder Hollow, you have to understand the forge that made her, because she had not come into that valley by chance, and she was not soft in the way the men who cast her out assumed her to be. She was born in the back room of her father's smithy, in a town called Cinder Hollow, wedged between two mountain ranges where the ore ran rich and the winters ran colder than most men could bear. And she was the only child of a blacksmith named Hendrick Voss, a man whose hands spoke a fluency that his mouth never quite managed, and who had buried a wife when Clara was 6 years old, and had never once in all the years that followed spoken her mother's name aloud again. Hendrick was not a man of comfort, and he did not try to soften the world for his daughter, because he did not believe in his bones that the world could be softened, only understood and worked. The way a bar of raw iron is worked patiently, and with respect for what it might become, he put a hammer in her small hand when she was 12 years old, and by 14 she could shoe a horse without his help. And by 16 she could draw the edge of a blade so fine it would part a hair floating in still water. And he told her, more than once in the low voice he saved for the things that mattered most to him, that iron never forgets what is done to it, that every blow, every heating, and every quenching stays folded somewhere inside the metal, waiting, and that the whole art of the smith is nothing more than learning to guide that memory toward its truest shape. Hendrick Voss died on a winter afternoon in front of his own forge, his heart simply stopping mid-swing, the hammer falling from his hand before his body did, and he left behind 2 children, a 17-year-old daughter named Clara, who understood the forge better than any man in 3 counties, and a 16-year-old son named Elias, who understood better than anyone the inside of a saloon and the particular, bottomless comfort of a bottle when the world asked too much of him. And he left behind, too, though nobody spoke of it for a long while, a quiet debt owed to the richest man in the valley, a man named Silas Kray, who owned the bank and the mine, and, in every way that mattered on paper, the town itself. Elias never inherited his father's patience, and he never learned to sit with a piece of work until it yielded. And for 2 long years, Clara carried the weight of him without complaint, shoeing horses and mending broken tools and quietly paying down what he owed, one small job at a time, the way her father had taught her to close a seam in metal, slowly and without haste, until the night Elias sat down at Silas Kray's private table, with the last thing their family owned still standing to his name, the forge itself, and signed it away on a single sheet of paper, in a drunken hand that barely resembled his own. Silas Kray was a lean, cold-eyed man who wore a clean waistcoat even in August, and who had built, over 20 patient years, something close to absolute power over the valley that bore his name on half its deeds. And when he lifted that signed paper from the table that night, the smile that crossed his face was not the smile of a man who had won something, but the smile of a man whose long, careful trap had finally sprung shut exactly the way he had planned it. Clara would see that smile again for years afterward, in the dark hour before sleep, because it was not a triumphant smile at all. It was a patient one, and patient men, she came to understand, were the most dangerous men a person could ever meet. She had felt something was wrong, even before Kray's men arrived at her door the following morning, because Elias had come home the night before with his eyes red and his hands shaking, and had told her, in a voice scraped hollow, that he had lost everything, and Clara had heard in that single sentence her father's voice rising up inside her own memory, clear as if he had spoken it the day before, telling her that a smith never, under any circumstance, wagers the labor of his family across a card table. When morning came, 3 of Kray's men stood at the smithy door with the signed paper in hand, and behind them, saying nothing, stood the town sheriff, a man who belonged to Silas Kray in every way that mattered. And Clara stood in the doorway and tried to argue, tried to explain that 30 years of her father's labor could not be erased by one night of her brother's foolishness, until one of the men shoved her, with a single flat hand, out into the street, and Elias stood by and watched it happen, and said not one word in her defense. That night, walking away from the only home she had ever known, toward the foot of the mountain, Clara carried nothing but her father's oldest hammer and a fistful of dried beans in her coat pocket, because everything else, every tool, every stick of furniture, every memory made of wood and iron, had passed into Silas Kray's ledger along with the forge itself, and Elias walked beside her for exactly one night before he told her, without meeting her eyes, that he meant to try his luck in Denver, and left her alone in the dark on the second evening. And Clara understood then, with a bitterness that settled into her chest like a stone, that she could trust no one again, not a friend, and least of all a brother. Clara walked for 2 days along the base of the mountains without food, without shelter, and without a plan beyond simply putting one foot ahead of the other. And on the evening of the 3rd day, in the last failing light, she saw a stone chimney rising crooked out of a stand of dead pine on the slope above her, and when she climbed toward it, she found the collapsed remains of an old smelting furnace. Its roof caved in, its walls blackened with a generation of soot, but its foundation remarkably still holding true beneath the ruin. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of sulfur and old iron, the particular scent that Clara had known her whole life, and as her eyes adjusted to the dark, she made out the shape of a great smelting crucible still standing at the center of the room, and along the walls, rusted but recognizable, the bones of an old smith's trade, bellows and tongs and a cracked anvil, tools whose language, unlike almost anyone else who might have stumbled onto this ruin, she could read as easily as her own name. She made a bed of dry straw that night in the corner behind the bellows, and she slept with her father's hammer close against her hand, because he had told her once in that same low voice that a smith should never sleep far from his tools. And in the morning, driven by hunger into searching the ruin for anything of use, she noticed a single floor slab near the back wall that sat higher than the stones around it, subtly wrong in a way that only a careful eye would ever catch. The slab was ringed not by the same hard mortar as the rest of the floor, but by loose dry earth, and Clara, drawing on the same patience her father had spent years pressing into her hands, worked the haft of the hammer beneath its edge as a lever, and worked it slowly upward until beneath it, where she had expected only more dirt, she found the unmistakable outline of an iron box, sunk into a hollow that someone long ago had dug and lined and sealed with deliberate, careful hands. The box was rusted but sound, and when Clara pried it open with trembling fingers, she found inside it a bundle of papers wrapped in oiled cloth, a small but heavy leather pouch, and resting on top of everything else, a letter, its ink faded but still perfectly legible, addressed simply to whoever might one day find this place. She sat back on her heels in the cold ruin and began carefully to read. The letter had been written by a man named Jonas Reyes, a smelter who had worked this very furnace some 30 years before, and in it he explained, in a hand grown shaky toward the end, that he had discovered a rich vein of gold belonging by rights to the valley's original founding family, and that the man who had owned the mine at that time, the elder Kray, father to the very Silas Kray who now ruled the valley, had been quietly working to steal that vein out from under the family who owned it, and that Jonas Reyes, refusing to be made a party to the theft, had hidden both the map to the vein and the original deed of ownership here, in this floor, in the hope that someone with an honest heart would one day find them and set the old wrong right. And beneath that map, folded inside a second sheet of paper yellowed with age, was the deed itself, official and formally sealed, and Clara's breath caught somewhere in her throat when she read the name written across the bottom of it, in bold, careful script, because the name written there, the name of the family who had first claimed this valley and this mountain and everything buried beneath it, was her own. Voss. It seemed that generations before, a Voss ancestor had been among the very first to stake a claim on Cinder Hollow, and that the mine, the whole of it, had been taken from that family through a fraud so old that almost no one living still remembered the truth of it. And now, sitting alone in a collapsed furnace with nothing left in the world but a hammer and a handful of beans, Clara held in her 2 hands both the proof of that old theft and the map to the fortune it had been built to hide. Clara sat a long while that night, with the papers spread across her lap, and she thought of something her father had told her once, on an evening much like this one. That iron, no matter how many times it is bent or beaten or forced into some other shape, never truly loses the memory of what it once was, and that given the right hand and the right moment, it will always find its way back toward its truest form. In the morning, she wrapped the box carefully in cloth, tucked it beneath her arm alongside her father's hammer, and walked down out of the mountains toward town. And this time she did not walk with fear in her chest, but with purpose, because she understood now something she had not understood before, that the truth, like iron, could be buried and hidden and denied for 30 long years, and it would still, in the end, in the right hands, find its shape. She went straight to the small land office in town, where a careful, spectacled clerk named Mr. Whitfield examined her documents by lamplight for the better part of an hour, turning each page over with the particular reverence of a man who understands he is holding something that matters. And when he finally looked up at her, he told her plainly that if these papers proved genuine, they could undo 3 decades of injustice in a single afternoon, and he promised her a formal inquiry would begin without delay. When word reached Silas Kray, he laughed the story off within earshot of half the town. But as the days passed, as old miners came forward one by one to say they remembered the name Jonas Reyes, and remembered, too, the old rumors about the Voss claim, his laughter grew thinner and thinner, until, 3 weeks later, the district court handed down its ruling and declared the mine, the mountain, and every acre of ground attached to it the rightful and lawful property of Clara Voss. Clara took the mine back the way her father would have taken back a piece of scrap iron, with patience, and with an honesty that asked nothing dishonest of anyone else, and she rebuilt the old ruined furnace on the slope with her own hands, board by board and stone by stone, until it stood again as the beating heart of a new forge for the whole valley, and in time, the people of Cinder Hollow came to speak her name, not as the blacksmith's daughter, who had lost everything in one bad night, but as the rightful heir who had walked into the ashes and carried the whole town back out of them. Her brother Elias never returned from Denver, and Clara found to her own quiet surprise that she carried no bitterness for him, and no particular longing either, only the plain understanding, one her father had tried gently to give her long before, that some pieces of metal, no matter how long they sit in the fire, simply never find their true shape again. To this day, on the wall of the rebuilt smithy in Cinder Hollow, her father's old hammer still hangs in its place of honor, and travelers passing near the old furnace on the mountain, especially on the wild, windswept nights when the weather turns, still say they hear faint and far off the steady, patient ring of a hammer striking iron somewhere up in the dark, though whether that sound belongs to the wind moving through broken stone, or to something else entirely, something the mountain has simply never let go of, no one in the valley has ever quite agreed to say for certain.